I haven't covered many cases that deal with the paranormal on this account, but this is a story that stuck out to me. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This story is from a woman named Whitney Renibi. The story takes place in a rural part of Oklahoma, sometime between 2019 or maybe early 2020. One night while her mother is just sitting in the living room just browsing through old photos on her phone, she comes across 3 pictures that startle her. On her camera roll were these 3 photos taken within minutes of each other around 3 in the morning just a few days prior. One is of her husband sleeping, one is of her daughter sleeping, and then one is of herself. She realized that no one else in the house had taken any of these photos, nor did her family have a history of sleepwalking. This is a family that has 5 dogs in the house, all of which tend to bark with strangers, but there was no sound that night. Till this day, she has no idea who took these pictures or how they were able to do so without disturbing the house or the dogs. The photos are a haunting mystery, leaving the family with one question: who took these pictures? Thank you to Ty Hopper for suggesting this case because it is eerie. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the disappearance of Michael Negrete. Michael was a freshman studying under a music scholarship at UCLA in the year 1999, described by his friends as very well liked and a very friendly kid. On December 10th, the night of his disappearance, Michael would attend a dorm party on the same floor as his dorm and then returns to his room and plays a computer video game against a friend who's in another room until 4 a.m. So right after 4, he leaves his dorm to go congratulate his friend across the hall for beating him in the video game and is then witnessed returning to his room. This is the last verified sighting of Michael. The following morning by 9 a.m., his roommate wakes up to find him gone. He hadn't taken any of his clothes, he hadn't taken his shoes, his keys were still there, his wallet, everything of his was still in the room. Police launch a campus-wide investigation that turns up almost nothing. No evidence of any kind of a secret life or a lover. There's no issues to support battles with depression or substance abuse. He didn't even have a car on campus. He's just gone. His disappearance is so mysterious that it gets upgraded from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. Multiple witnesses would come forward to report seeing an unknown Caucasian man on the dorm room floor the very night Michael went missing that nobody could account for. They release a sketch of the man, but he has never been identified and never comes forward. Till this day, the case remains unsolved and no one knows for sure what really happened to Michael that night. Thank you to everybody who asked me to do this case. I will do my best. It is highly detailed. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa. Bryce is a couple of days into his sophomore year of college when his friends start to notice that he's exhibiting strange behaviors, he's becoming paranoid and consuming substances, so they contact his parents. Concerned, his parents insist that he makes the 7-hour drive back home to stay with them. But the following morning, they get an alert of a service request at a rest stop called Button Willow, so they contact the station. They end up getting a hold of a serviceman who says he'll go check to see if Bryce is still around because he filled up his tank with gas just a few hours before. He does find Bryce, but finds that he's been sitting in the same exact spot for over 3 hours. His parents get a hold of him, and despite the odd behavior, they just end up insisting that he gets on the road. When he's still not home, his parents end up contacting the police. The phone company ends up doing an emergency trace of his cell phone and finds that he is still at this rest stop. It had been like an additional 9 hours of him sitting in the same exact location. Police do show up that evening and they're able to find him, so they end up questioning him. They run a sobriety test, but all of his behavior seems normal and they just have him call his parents, who surprisingly, despite all of this strange behavior, just insist that he gets back on the road. A few more hours go by and the same serviceman from before actually contacts the parents and says that he is still sitting at this rest stop doing nothing. He basically ushers Bryce into his car and then follows him onto the highway to make sure he gets on the road. This would be one of the last verified sightings of Bryce. Follow for part 2. This is part 2 of the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa. After he finally gets on the highway, his parents call him and they demand to know where he is. They want to know what landmarks he's around, what he's seeing. He ends up just saying it's too dark, he can't see anything, but his GPS says he'll be home by 3 in the morning. He then calls them back just after 2 a.m. and tells them that he's too tired to drive and he's going to pull off for the night. This would be the last conversation they ever have with Bryce. 6 minutes after that call, Bryce's car is caught on security camera going off-road. He had veered off the highway for an unknown reason and just starts accelerating through rough terrain going up towards a cell tower. At 2:15 a.m., his car is caught on the security camera and then disappears for 2 hours, which are completely unaccounted for, and is then seen one last time at 4:29 a.m. At 5:15 a.m., he floors his car going downhill and flips it off a 25-foot ledge into a ravine, but survives the crash. The car is found by the following morning with the window kicked out and all of his belongings inside, but he is nowhere to be found. Police conduct a number of searches using trace canines that were able to track that after the crash, he was able to travel pretty far on foot, but then at some point his trace just disappears. It's possible after the crash he had some sort of head injury and couldn't remember who he was, and he had just wandered off in confusion and gotten lost. But despite multiple search efforts, none of his remains nor any evidence of his whereabouts has ever been found. Till this day, the case is marred with endless questions about what really happened to Bryce that night. 3 of the most disturbing facial reconstructions of unknown people. Number 1 is the suitcase body. Before finally being identified as Jenny Gomez, her decomposed remains were found in a suitcase and then sketched by police. The state of her body was not good, and sadly this sketch is almost unrecognizable and doesn't really look like it has features of a normal person. Number 2 is the woman of Oklahoma Road. Discovered off I-40, when the remains were finally found, they were so badly decayed that police initially couldn't determine the sex of the body. Reconstructions of the skull indicated a very unusual bone structure and a body that only stood at about 4'8". This would have been a very recognizable person, but no one ever came forward to claim that they knew the woman of Oklahoma Road. Number 3 is the Ina Jane Doe. I don't like looking at this picture at all. It's really, really bad. It was in 1993 that the severed head of a disabled woman was found by a group of children in Illinois hanging from a bush. An attempt was made to reconstruct her features, but no one ever identified her. It was deemed as pretty unusual that a disabled woman wouldn't have anyone identify her, as she most likely had contact with either doctors or even a caretaker at some point. The Ina Jane Doe remains an unknown, and this reconstruction is by far one of the most disturbing. Imagine if your grandparents just disappeared, like completely without a trace. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the haunting story of Charles and Catherine Romer. On April 8th of 1980, a wealthy elderly couple named Charles and Catherine check into a Holiday Inn right off I-95. They're just on their way home from a vacation. But to put this in context, this wasn't a usual choice for them. These were two very well-off people, so to choose a Holiday Inn, it wouldn't have been typical of them. But not long after checking into their room, the couple seemingly vanished. After 2 or 3 days, hotel management became concerned that they hadn't seen the couple leave their room, so they went to go check on them. This was only to find that their room had never been slept in. Inside the room were all of their clothes, their travel diary, and over $60,000 of Catherine's jewelry. Hotel staff then goes out to the parking lot and finds that their car is missing, but no one ever saw them leave. At the time, only one witness comes forward saying that they saw this car miles away at a restaurant circuit, but after they interviewed people at the restaurant, nobody remembered seeing this couple. Despite search efforts, they were never found after that night, and no one really knows what happened to them. Caution, as there is a police sketch shown in this story that some people find distressing. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the disappearance of Zeb Quinn. On January 2nd of 2000, 18-year-old Zeb Quinn leaves his shift at work to go look at buying a new car with his friend Robert. Surveillance footage from a gas station confirms that they were together, but then Zeb's pager goes off and he has to make an emergency call at a payphone. Allegedly, Zeb doesn't say what the call is about and then abruptly cancels their plans. The next day, his job gets a call saying that he's going to be out sick, but they realize that it wasn't Zeb on the phone. It was actually Robert pretending to be Zeb. He later goes on to say that Zeb had contacted him asking him to call him out sick from work as a favor. But all of this is very suspicious, so Zeb's mother reports her son missing. On January 6th, Zeb's car is discovered right outside the hospital where his mother works. It was found with lips drawn on the window in lipstick, a live puppy inside, and a jacket that did not belong to him. Witnesses reported seeing this woman driving the car just before it was reported to police. She's gone before the car is reported, and she has never been identified, nor has Zeb ever been found. One of the newer developments is that the friend Robert was actually convicted of a murder which was unrelated in 2015, which prompted a search warrant. Police found elements of fabrics and unknown particles that they deemed sufficient to be able to connect and prove his involvement in Zeb's disappearance. I don't know why the details of this are so murky and why they won't say what they found, but as of 2021, Robert has been charged with the murder. But there are still gaps in this story about what evidence turned up and exactly who this woman was who was seen in the car. 3 of the most disturbing facial reconstructions of unknown people. Number 1 is Septic Tank Sam. Many people find this reconstruction to be very unsettling, but the context of the victim is actually so much worse. Discovered by a couple in 1977, the body had been stuffed into a septic tank and was wrapped in a yellow bedsheet. His remains had suffered such severe beatings and torture as well as sexual mutilation, it took them months just to determine the sex of the body. Decades later, through DNA evidence, they were finally able to determine that these were the remains of 26-year-old Gordy Sam, Anderson. However, the nature of the murder has never been determined. Number 2. Maria. Discovered in 1952, the remains were found in Black Hawk, Colorado, and they effectively named her Maria until they could determine her identity. But they never did. Examiners found that she had been struck in the head and that she may have been burned alive, but they're not certain. This reconstruction is pretty indicative of very early techniques and sadly wasn't very helpful so they could identify who she was, and she remained Maria. Number 3. The Montrose Jane Doe. This was a really horrific restoration that was later revised into something that would be more recognizable. The cause of death was never determined, but the suspicious nature of the body indicated this was most likely a homicide. Her older reconstruction was later archived as more modern composites were made. But till this day, the case is still cold, and she remains only known as the Montrose Jane Doe. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we're looking at 3 seemingly normal pictures with dark backgrounds. Number 1. At first glance, this kind of looks like just any other normal family picture around the holidays. Until you take a closer look at the father and see a hand on his shoulder that seemingly does not belong to anyone in this picture. Initially thought to be an optical illusion and that the arm here actually belongs to the boy in the middle, he later comes forward and says that he did not have his right arm around anyone, making the hand seen in this picture a chilling mystery. Number 2. This picture seen here looks like any other normal portrait, maybe of a couple in the early 1900s. But to fuel the horror, this is actually a post-mortem photograph, and the woman seen here is not alive in this photo. Post-mortem photography was actually a common cultural practice even through the early 1900s, where a deceased loved one was dressed and staged and then posed with their family or spouse for one final photo. Number 3. You might skim past this shot as just any other normal picture of maybe 2 college-age guys at a party, but this is actually a photo of Tyler Hardley after he just killed his parents. Just 3 hours after brutally murdering his parents with a hammer in the upstairs bedroom, he throws a party at his house with the bodies hidden upstairs. Guests at the party had absolutely no idea, making this picture terrifying in context. Before we get into the story, I am going to caution this with a warning, as it does involve assault as well as minors. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the haunting story of the Beast of Jersey. So when we're talking about Jersey here, we're not talking about New Jersey. We're talking about the island of Jersey, which is right off the coast of France. This is a very small town on this island, and it was completely terrorized by a man in a mask through the 1960s. He was known to wander the streets at night, where he would break into houses through open windows and kidnap and assault women and children. To locals, this man was known as the Beast of Jersey. He was described with a wretched smell, and he would wear nail-studded garments and a horrible rubber mask and then climb through windows only between the hours of 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. Desperate for answers, the public and their paranoia had initially suspected this man, a local fisherman who was known to be eccentric and lived alone. Locals were actually so enraged that they burned down this man's cottage and he self-exiled. But those suspicions are soon cleared when attacks from the Beast continued. It wasn't until 1971 when attention is turned to a man named Edward Pinnell. Edward was a local construction worker and a husband. He had no real criminal record to account for. But when pulled over one night by police, officers would notice several costumed items in his car. These costumed items matched the description of the Beast. He is arrested and tried and would face 30 years behind bars, convicted on all counts of his brutal assaults. But the painfully dark history of the island still remembers the 11-year reign of the Beast of Jersey. I think as we get a bit closer to Halloween, I'm going to try to cover some Halloween-specific cases and mysteries on this account. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the mysterious case of Chris Jenkins. On Halloween night in 2002, 21-year-old college student Chris Jenkins goes out for a night with friends in downtown Minneapolis. At around midnight, his friends lose track of him and can't seem to find him anywhere, so his sudden disappearance is reported to the police. Chris remained missing for 4 months until his body was discovered in the Mississippi River. Police had immediately recognized him because he was still wearing his Halloween costume in the water. Ruled as maybe an accidental drowning because he was drunk, his parents insisted there might be something else going on here and pushed for a further investigation. A re-examination of his remains deemed that his death was not accidental, but a homicide. Authorities remained very quiet about public details of the investigation, but an incarcerated witness would come forward to say that he witnessed the murder of Chris that night and that his body had been dumped into the river off a bridge. This has never been substantiated by evidence. Authorities believe that this man has no reason to be lying about this. This case case has also been theorized to be connected to a string of mysterious deaths around the Smiley Face murders. Around the same time that Chris went missing, there would be at least 40 other college-age males who go missing and are found dead under strange circumstances involving drownings and mysterious locations in water. The scenes where these bodies were discovered were all marked with mysterious smiley faces that would be spray painted and graffitied onto walls and landmarks. This is a case for a whole other video. The case of Chris has never been connected to these other deaths, but remains a mystery as to what really happened to Chris that Halloween night. Here are 3 of the most disturbing police sketches and the chilling backstories behind them. Number 1 is Mr. Cruel. This is an unknown man who was never caught but was a serial child predator who was targeting Australia through the late 80s. Described as a brutal assailant, he was also very cautious to conceal his identity and was always seen wearing a tightly fitted ski mask so that his victims could only see through to his eyes. Number 2 is the Eerie-Eyed Man. This is an infamously haunting sketch of a repeat window voyeur who had at least one credible account of entry and assault of a woman. Reported in 2016 and made famous for the unsettling features and disturbingly oversized eyes, this sketch is a haunting reminder that the suspect has never been caught and is still out there somewhere. Number 3. I actually find this one really difficult to look at for some reason. It's just very upsetting and distressing. This is actually a sketch of a suspect who would later be known as the Baton Rouge Killer. Initially a miss, police believed they were looking for a white male when in fact they would be looking for a suspect named Derek Todd Lee. But despite the sketch looking very different from the actual suspect, what's really eerie about it is that this is the expression that the victim remembers seeing on the suspect's face on the night of the attack. I don't know if it's the slightly distorted features or it's that kind of emotionless stare, but there's something about this picture that just doesn't sit right. 3 of the most disturbing police sketches and the chilling backstories behind them. Number 1, the Handyman. On the night of June 5th, 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was abducted from her bed at knife point by this man. Her little sister was right in the same room pretending to sleep while everything went down. The immediate suspect was a handyman who had worked on the house just a few months prior. Despite being chilling, that sketch actually led investigators on a credible tip that took them to Brian Mitchell and his wife, where they had been keeping Elizabeth in remote captivity for 9 months. Number 2, the Newborn Woman. On March 10th, 2007, at 1:20 in the morning, an unknown woman was seen roaming the hospital floor at Lakeside Hospital. Dressed as a nurse in scrubs, she abducted a newborn baby girl that night and then seemingly disappeared. Through anonymous tips, she was located within 48 hours, but the way she was able to scour the hospital and evade security remains completely unknown. Number 3. Lime Lady. This actually isn't a sketch of a suspect, but a victim. In 1980, the body of an unknown woman was discovered by 2 fishermen near a river. She had been covered in quicklime in an effort to decompose her, but it actually counteracted and she was preserved. For more than 40 years, she remained an unknown woman, and this sketch was a haunting reminder of her missing identity. But in 2020, DNA evidence was finally able to identify her as 20-year-old Tamara Lee Tagard, who went missing while on a walk just 4 months prior. Her remains are now known, but the reason for her murder is not. How is it possible for an entire group of people to hear or see someone who doesn't actually exist? Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the unexplained mystery of Frida Sofia. In 2017, Mexico was hit with a devastating earthquake that crushed multiple buildings. One of those buildings being a school right in Mexico City. There were, of course, numerous children and adults who were trapped under the rubble, but there was one girl in particular who caught the attention of the media. A 12-year-old girl trapped under the debris who was responding to rescuers saying that her name was Frida Sofia. There was round-the-clock coverage, and a nation assembled around the story of Frida, and she became a symbol of hope in these efforts to rescue the children and her. Rescuers and journalists had multiple accounts of speaking with Frida and confirmed that she was far down beneath the rubble underneath a piece of granite but physically stable. There are some responders who report even seeing her wiggle her fingers far down through a crack in the debris. But here's the problem. Frida did not exist. The school actually comes forward and makes a statement saying that they have all children accounted for and they have never had a record of a girl named Frida Sofia. Multiple stations and people of leadership have to come forward and make statements of retraction and say that she's not down there, she never was, and she's not real. Suspected of being one of the largest cases of mass hysteria in modern history, it is completely unexplained how there were so many separate accounts of people who claimed to speak to her or even see her beneath the rubble. Ultimately, the existence of Frida is a complete mystery, and there are still some people who believe she was really down there in that debris. I've never researched a case that has had more unexplainable circumstances than this. This is the mystery of Dyatlov Pass. For those who aren't familiar with the story, this is in 1959 when 9 experienced Russian hikers hikers are reported missing after a mountain expedition. A search crew was sent to look for them, and what they found was horrific. Their tent was there, but it had been cut from the inside as if they were trying to escape it. The search party that was there didn't find any evidence of a threat outside of the tent, so why they cut their way out was completely unknown. But even stranger than that, the footprints that were found outside of the tent indicated that after they cut their way out, they weren't running. They were just walking normally. The bodies are all discovered kind of scattered in a several-mile radius throughout the snow, some of them half-dressed. 6 of them died from hypothermia, and 3 of them died from an unknown blunt force trauma causing severe damage to the skull and chest. 2 of them are found without eyes, 1 with their tongue cut out, and 1 without eyebrows. 1 of the bodies also tested positive for unusually high levels of radiation in their clothing. The most widely accepted theory is that this was some kind of an avalanche that had melted by the time the search party came, and that the missing eyes and tongue were just attributed to animals. But let's talk about some contradicting evidence here. These were 9 very experienced hikers that would know enough not to set up camp in any sort of a danger zone, nor was there any evidence that an avalanche even occurred by the time the search party came. That, in addition to the slow-moving footprints outside of the tent when they were supposedly trying to outrun this avalanche, or even the radiation in the clothing. The case has never conclusively been closed, but no one really knows for sure what they saw that night that made them cut their way out of their tent. Here are 3 seemingly normal pictures with very dark backstories. Number 1, the Whitaker family. What looks like maybe just a normal family out to dinner, this was actually the same night that Bart Whitaker had hired 2 friends to come and kill his entire family. Plotting to do so for monetary gain, the only survivor of the hit was the father, who is not pictured here as he was the one taking this photo. Number 2, Green Boots. Maybe this looks like just a snow hiker taking a break or a nap, but it's actually one of the hundreds of bodies that remain on Mount Everest as the conditions are impossible to retrieve them. Because they are left, they remain only as landmarks for future hikers. Number 3, Carl Tanzler's doll. Maybe this looks like a poor rendition of a wax figure, but it's actually the corpse of Elena Hoyos. Following her death in her 20s, a man named Carl Tanzler became obsessed with her and ended up stealing and taxidermying her body, where it remained in his home and bed for 10 years. I'm gonna show you a picture that you've probably seen before, but maybe don't want to again. The Dream Man. In 2008, this drawing was published and everybody saw it. It was accompanied with the tagline, "Have you seen this man?" The implication being that this was a familiar person to everyone that they had seen in their dreams, but it wasn't somebody they'd seen in real life. The photo gained a real sense of momentum by 2009 and was traced back to marketer Andrea Natella. Let's first note that this was released as a hoax. This is part of what Andrea does. He leans heavily into shock value tactics for marketing, and clearly it was very successful because it reached a lot of people. But even though it was debunked as just marketing, why was the image successful? Why were there so many people that had believed that they'd seen this man before, at least enough for it to go viral? One theory leans heavily into Jungian archetypes, which suggests we have a sort of preset collective unconsciousness that we can recognize and feel familiar around certain archetypal faces in different times of distress or in life. While still not completely understood and very much so just a theory, it's believed that the imprints of these archetypal faces are something that's inherited. It's a form of unconscious memory which was passed down from ancestors. So we can understand that as a theory. You know, it would explain the strange sense of familiarity that we all feel when looking at that face. But what are the origins of that? If we do have this sort of preset collective unconsciousness, why is it this face that fits into one of those archetypes that we all find to be familiar? This is True Crime by State. Today we are covering Arizona. I know everybody thought I was going to do Jody on this, and I will do a video on her story, but this story floored me. This is the story of Phoenix, Arizona man Scott Falater, otherwise known as the Sleepwalker. On the night of January 16th, 1997, a neighbor wakes up to the sounds of screaming coming from next door. He then witnesses Scott dragging his wife of 20 years as her body lay lifeless and bloodied, and then pushes her head under the water of the backyard pool. Police rush to the scene and pull her out of the water and find that she had been stabbed 44 times. They find Scott right up the stairs and arrest him in the house and then usher his children to safety. The initial story, when he kind of comes to, is that he was in a deep state of sleepwalking. Okay, so you hear that and the first thing you think is, this is bull, this is bull. But corroborating reports from his family and friends do indicate that he has a severe struggle with sleepwalking, and his defense actually goes on to argue this in court to plead for his innocence. Although the defense testimony is compelling, there is a witness that comes forward that says he saw him trying to calm down the family dog during the murder, which they believe can essentially prove that he was conscious and aware. He's served with a life sentence, but to this day, he maintains that he has no memory of the attack. Shockingly, this is not the first case of homicidal sleepwalking, which is terrifying, but this one in particular definitely stands out for the state. And truthfully, we'll never actually know whether or not he was or wasn't sleepwalking that night. I don't find this case to be a mystery. I see this more as a cover-up. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the mysterious case of Tamala Horsford. November 3rd, 2018. Tamala arrives to an adult slumber party with a group of women from the local football league, some of which she did not know very well. There were also 3 men at the party, either boyfriends or a husband, and some would even spend the night. The last reported sighting was around 2 in the morning when she's seen in the kitchen just before leaving to go have a cigarette on the porch while everyone else was asleep. The backdoor security system registered the door opening, closing, and then opening again at around 1:57 a.m., and that was it. The following morning, Tamala is discovered face down at the bottom of the balcony just off the porch. By 8:59 a.m., Jose Barrera, the homeowner's boyfriend, is already on the phone with 911. On the phone, he's almost describing the potential manner in which she died without even being asked by the operator. It should also be noted that Jose worked in law enforcement at the time, which has been a very suspect part of this case. The scene of the death is handled very haphazardly, and an initial autopsy would rule the death an accident, citing blunt force trauma from the fall. This is only about a 15-foot drop, so the family is immediately suspicious and they commission a private autopsy. That autopsy would find significant damage to the body, including scratches and multiple lacerations, a severely broken wrist and broken neck, not necessarily congruent with a 15-foot fall, but maybe more so a beating. The death is still ruled accidental for the time being, but there are increasingly suspicious details around it. Follow for part 2. This case is gonna give you chills. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This story is from a man named Grady Hendrix about his childhood back in the 80s. So his parents had moved into this house around May of 1981. He's like any other 9-year-old kid. He realizes he can sneak downstairs in the middle of the night and grab anything he wants from the kitchen without his parents finding out. Until one night, while he's sneaking down in the dark, he hears something that makes him freeze. The sound of a fork hitting a counter in the kitchen. From the hallway, he can see the outline of a tall, thin man who had been eating at the kitchen counter. He races upstairs and he gets his parents up from their sleep, but of course by the time they go downstairs, there's nothing. But over the next couple of months, there's odd instances of strange noises in the house, there's things being misplaced in the kitchen. Over that summer, while he's lying awake in bed, he hears movements coming from the ceiling above him, so he flips over on his back. He recounts seeing a pair of eyes staring back at him from the ceiling vent. He becomes hysterical, his parents get up, they have to search the attic, they search all the crawl spaces, but still, they're not finding anything. They just keep assuming that he's freaked himself out. But by the end of that summer, an HVAC inspector comes to the house and finds something horrific. The rotting remains of a dead man who had crawled into their vent system and was living in their walls. I can't think of anything more chilling than that, but of course what this meant was that everything Grady had seen was real. Since I've heard this story, I can't look at the vents in my house. I'm so freaked out. I had to get myself up and out of bed for this because I'd never heard of this case before. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. These are the 13 unaccounted minutes before Patrice Andres went missing. On April 15th of 2004, Patrice, who's a local salon owner in Georgia, walks into her shop and finishes her last client at exactly 11:37 a.m. Another client then calls the shop at 11:50, to which there's no answer, which is very unlike Patrice. In that 13-minute window, something happens in that salon where Patrice goes missing. The next client comes in to find the shop empty, and police are called to the scene, which is eerily undisturbed. Aside from some missing money in the register, there's nothing that's out of place, there's no sign of a struggle, even her lunch is still sitting there warmed up. But 2 separate witnesses would come forward to report passing the salon within that time frame. Both witnesses come forward to report seeing a light blue sedan parked out front and 2 unidentified women standing next to it. One of the women was described as tall with dark hair and the other short with light hair. These eyewitness accounts mark one of the only insights as to what happened in those 13 minutes. After 20 months of searching, her remains are finally found at the bottom of a ravine, but the manner of death is unknown. Initially, her husband is suspected to be involved as maybe a jealous spouse, but a scrutinizing investigation would rule him out. She leaves behind her 15-year-old son at the time, who till this day continues to search for answers as to what really happened to his mom on April 15th. So what are your theories as to those 13 unknown minutes? Halloween is here, Halloween is upon us, it has come. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we are looking at 3 unexplained pictures caught on camera, and number 3 is horrifying. Number 1. Loch Ness Lake is famously known as a lake that houses a legendary creature known as the Loch Ness Monster. In a recent photo captured by a tourist, they spot the back of something strange in those waters. This might look like just a large fish, but by proximity to the landmarks around it, whatever this is in the water, it's over 8 feet in length. Number 2. This photo was captured in 2010 with a group of UK teenagers hanging around a construction site for a nearby building. They took several photos on a digital camera and immediately noticed the figure in the window behind them. Freaked out, a couple of the guys try to climb the scaffolding to call out to whoever's hiding in that building, but to their shock, when they got up to the window, they saw that the floor hadn't even been finished in the building and no one could have been standing at that window. Number 3. Everybody knows the McDonald's Playscape is a kid's dream location. So when a mother and daughter arrived at one nearby, they were excited to see that there were no other parents or kids around. It was completely empty. While playing in the Playscape, the mother captures this photo and sees a gray face standing right next to her daughter inside the tunnel. When the daughter comes down, the mother is distressed and she inquires about who this other child is who's inside the Playscape alone, to which her daughter replies, it's her imaginary friend, Beto. This is a terrifying case. It's terrifying because it could happen to any of us. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the haunting story of the Watcher. On June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus and their 3 children are moving into what they believe is their dream home. This house would later be known as the infamous 657 Boulevard. 3 days following the sale, an anonymous letter is received signed The Watcher. The letter would describe intimate details about the family and claim to be from someone who was watching the house. The letter is brought to the police with the former homeowners, and they're instructed to keep everything quiet while the investigation is underway. 2 weeks would pass and a second letter is received detailing even more knowledge of the family. Chillingly, the letter is now describing things that are taking place inside the home. Things that you could only report seeing if you were watching through a window. The letter would describe details of watching their daughter paint from inside the house. The family would actually remove their children from the home and then worked for 2 years trying to sell it. But at this point, details of the case and rumors of the house had already circulated through the media, and the house was essentially unsellable. In 2016, they're finally able to find a buyer, but then another letter is received. This letter is vicious and threatening, even going as far as to threaten an accident that could happen to a family member. Despite security cameras, fingerprint samples, cold leads, police are never able to identify the Watcher. Nor do they know if the Watcher is still watching 657 Boulevard. I've wanted to cover this case for so long. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the mysterious disappearance of Frederick Valentich. On the evening of October 21st in 1978, Australian pilot Frederick would rent a commercial aircraft for a routine cargo trip. At 7:06 p.m., he radios in to air traffic control to ask if there's any expected air traffic at the 5,000-foot level, to which air traffic control says no. He reports seeing a long, metallic aircraft with 4 bright lights moving at very fast speeds. The control room starts to notice a panic in his voice as he realizes the aircraft is getting closer to his, and he asks if maybe it could be a military plane, due to the unknown appearance and the speeds it's able to travel. But the control room repeats they have no knowledge of any known aircraft that's supposed to be in that area, nor one that fits that description. While trying to identify what he's seeing, he radios in that the aircraft is now hovering above his, and he describes a bright green light shining from the base and a shiny metallic exterior. Frederick is then heard on the radio for one final time where he says, "It's not an aircraft." His transmission is then interrupted by an unknown sound which was described as metal scratching together before going completely static. This was his last recorded correspondence before his plane is deemed missing. Despite search efforts and investigations, his plane is never found, and no one really knows what Frederick saw that night. Those final last words are some that have haunted the flight community for decades.